Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been here after a long time, and it's always a shock to see how beautiful this place is, and you're lucky to have it. Thank you, Sal, for having us. You know, she's already introduced Mani, but I just want to add a couple of lines about him before we start on the evening, because it's not every day that you get to meet somebody who's a diplomat, a political leader, but also been accused of being a communist, who's a secularist, all bad words in today's world. He's also been a maverick. He's an author, a columnist, all of that. But wonderfully, in his own words, he says it takes him 500 words just to clear his throat. So he's written a memoir which is in 3 parts. And since he stopped in the 1990s, what I'm going to do is to take the prerogative, since we're all here, is to also preview his life over the next 50 or 40 years that he hasn't embarked on yet. So we're going to have a very garrulous evening and hopefully a fun one. So,
very much.
Thank you. Yes. So, Mani, as I said, there's so many epithets around you, and I forgot one more, which is a cruel one, but like you said, you have the capacity for humor, that quite apart from being a Congress veteran, a sharp, scathing media piece once said that he was the tour and travel guide for Rajiv Gandhi. So that's one more epithet that we're going to unpack. But Mani, I wanted to start with the one really seminal character in your life that fascinated me, who was your mother. She shaped you greatly, as you said, and she had very unusual origins. She was a dynamic woman, really pushing against her time. So please share with the audience a little bit about her.
Yeah, well, I suppose I am in some ways the product of my mother. So are all of us. But in my case, it was a very unusual upbringing, principally because my mother was orphaned at the age of 8 and was farmed out as a kind of domestic servant to the extended family. And there was a lady called Sister Subbalakshmi in Chennai, in what was then called Madras, who was running a home for child widows. And she more or less kidnapped my mother from where she was, took her to Madras, gave her an education which was paid for on scholarships of 5 rupees a month. She managed to pass her school exams. She got into Queen Mary's College and she did a BA from there. And then she joined the Madras Education Service. And her first posting was to Visakhapatnam. And when she arrived there, the officers receiving her didn't know what to do with her because they'd never met a 20-year-old woman who had no family and who had no one to look after her and who was branching out entirely on her own. So they looked around and they found that the Vice-Chancellor of Andhra University had a large house in which he was living more or less alone. And so they asked him whether they'd take her in as a paying guest. That Vice-Chancellor was Dr. S. Radhakrishnan and was to play a major role in my life subsequently. So she started making her life on her own. She had a sister, she had some younger brothers, but there were no elders to look after her. So she was entirely on her own. And she decided that if she was going to make a career in education, she had to get a degree from England. In those days, I'm talking of the early 1930s, it was not possible to move forward without being London returned. So she borrowed a lot of money from a friend and caught a Lloyd Tristino boat from Bombay, as it was then called, and headed out to London. But when they reached Suez, news came that war had broken out in Europe, that Hitler had invaded Poland, and so she was a third-class passenger, but she'd noted that Ambalal Sarabhai was in the first class. And so she decided that if Ambalal Sarabhai got off at Port Said, she would get off at Port Said. And when he did, she got off too and was taken by an Italian liner to a little country called Eritrea, of which you've possibly heard. And from there, she somehow made her way to Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was known then. And on her way from Sri Lanka to Madras, she lost her trunk, all her possessions. So she arrived back in Madras a month after she'd left with no possessions other than the sari which she was wearing. Fortunately, she had a sister who was in London, in Delhi, and she said, well, there's nothing I can do for you where you are, so you come to meet me. And when my mother eventually agreed to go to Delhi, she then wrote to her to say that she had a friend who would pick her up at the Agra's Raja Ki Mandi station, and that she could look at him until they arrived at Agra Cant, and if she felt confident enough, then she could get off the train with him to see the Taj Mahal. And she did that, and that's my origins. So if Hitler had not been, I would not have been. It seems to be a pity that I had to take 6 million Jews to their camps in order to be born. But those are my origins. I owe my beginnings, 1 to my mother and 2 to Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, we should take a quick poll to see whether you were worth it, Mani.
In fact, because she had no family, she also had a very peculiar wedding. It was not in her house. The wedding didn't take place in the bride's house. It took place in the bridegroom's house. But unfortunately, my father was killed in an air accident when I was only 12. And so she then shifted house to Dehradun, and I was brought up in Dehradun by her. And in my youth, I don't think they remember her now, but in my youth, I was always identified as the son of the lady who drove her own car. The only person, the only woman driving her own car in Dehradun in the 1950s was Amma.
Right. So, Mani, the reason I found her a fascinating person because, like you said, in the 1930s, to be so intrepid, with absolutely nothing, and so she probably played a big role in the kind of maverick adjective that comes in you. But
she herself was a maverick. She had no inhibitions about pushing herself on people. It used to be a bit embarrassing the way she'd arrive up with her brood of 4 children and turn up at somebody's house and say, we've come to stay for 2 months. And they were left with no alternative but to put us up.
Well, one more insight about Mani, which might help explain why he turned out the way he did, is that the same amazing, eclectic, maverick mother also left him in the wrong school. She thought she was putting him into Doon, but left him in Wellams, So
Well, that's a story where my brother and I we were refugees from Pakistan. So there was nowhere really to live in Delhi. So she more or less kidnapped us and took us to Bombay, to Dehradun. And we were told we were being put in Doon school. And I went in, I was 8, my brother was 6. And then in the evening I went to see my brother. That's Swaminathan Aiyar, whom you probably know better than you know me. He was very bright even at the age of 6. And when I went to see him in that first evening, he said, we're not at Doon school. So I said, what? Then he took me along to see to the gate, and outside there was a big board saying Welham School for Indian Boys. So I thought my mother had brought us to the wrong school, wouldn't be able to find us in the morning, and that we were going to be abandoned for the rest of our lives. But when she arrived, she took the attitude of Natha Singh, Prem Singh, one and the same thing. So she said, why do you want to be in Doon school? You'll be in Welham.
So, Mani, I want to quickly take you more into your public realm, but just a couple more insights because this is the personal side of you we've not yet met or deciphered. So one was her, you know, and I think we've given a flavor of how madcap and resolute she was. But you said that your parents were in a terrible marriage and it was a very fraught and, you know, it wasn't a harmonious marriage. But your father, so can you give us some insight into how did your father and your mother shape you? You know, what did they leave behind with you? And how did their marriage affect you?
Well, although they did something very unusual for the year 1940, which was to have a love marriage, as it was called, I think love died on the first night because my father said to her that I really wanted to marry your sister. So, I mean, that, I can't think of a more disastrous beginning of a marriage than that. And although she had 4 children, uh, my own memories of my early childhood are simply of them quarreling all the time. So I was absolutely determined that I would never get married because I thought all marriages were like this. And in fact, I was very embarrassed about it because I didn't realize that there are other parents who also quarrel. So when I learnt in Welham when I was about 9 or 10 that there were other boys whose parents quarreled, I was tremendously relieved that it was not just mine who were endlessly quarreling. And I've said rather cruelly in my book that I think it was my father's death that really liberated my mother and enabled her to be what she always was, a highly independent woman who knew how to make her way in the world and would do so irrespective of what obstacles came in the way.
So I don't want to psychologize that Mani, but did that leave any residues that you can at all sort of recognize in yourself?
I was so determined I wouldn't get married that for years after I did, my wife would wake me up in the middle of the night and ask me why I hadn't proposed to her.
Right. Maybe we should have Suneet here to see you to ask her what kind of husband you were.
Well, she's sitting here, so you can get her side of the story.
Yeah. I can't spot her. Well, the fact that she's still married to you says something, Mani.
Sorry?
I said the fact that she's still married to you says something.
Oh,
That's
we've
a
done
character
52
certificate.
years.
Wow, that's amazing. So, Mani, you know, as I said, I want to move to your public life, but there was another phrase there which caught my attention, which is that you said eventually you did make it to Doon, and that Doon whelms this entire life. In addition to that, you're a Brahmin, but that particularly the Doon life left you with this very innate sense of arrogance, you know, that you guys were the best in the world, that within the school everyone was equal, but everyone outside was less than who you were. And that's actually accusation that has followed many, many of the top echelons of Congress for decades, you know, that all of you were an arrogant lot and that you made everybody else feel rustic and unmodern. Will you unpack that for us?
Well, I don't think we knew we were arrogant. When I went to St. Stephen's, there was a chap from Sanaa who said to me that he hated all Doon School boys. So I asked him why. He said, "You bastards walk around this place as if you own it." So I said, "But we don't. So why don't you walk around as if you own it?" I think that was the difference. That somehow the school gave us an enormous amount of self-confidence. It was perhaps an excess of self-confidence because really 90% or more of Doon School boys have not in any way distinguished themselves, have not in any way justified their sense of arrogance. And I don't think 90% of them are arrogant. They have been beaten by life. They have been beaten by the world. But there was a bonding that took place between the ages of 12 and 17. And that bonding is so strong that my batch, my class of 1957, today, which is 60 years later, 70 years later, we get together about once a month because somehow, having been together in early adolescence and through that very difficult period of growing up, we got an identity which we've maintained all our lives, often to our disadvantage, but occasionally to our advantage.
So I'll cut you short there because there's so much to talk further, you know. But that's a bond all boarding school kids form. I was more asking if we have time, I'll come back to that. I was just talking about this Doon School Stephens syndrome, and you know, you said it taught you all to be brown sahibs, you know, and that you actually like being Macaulay's child, and that you felt more at home in Cambridge than back in India. Do you look back to regret that? Do you think that those were some of the seeds that led to the great, I mean, there are many seeds that led to the rise of the BJP, but do you think this syndrome of Doon, Stephens, Cambridge, Brown Sahib, you know, Macaulay's child has some seeds to where the country is today?
At that time, I wasn't very conscious of it. It just seemed natural to be at these institutions one after the other. Of course, one had to do well academically to move from Doon to St. Stephen's. And then I came to the conclusion in St. Stephen's, after 2 years of attempting to acquire a girlfriend, that it was impossible for me to acquire an Indian girlfriend, and therefore I had to go abroad to find one. And so I'm the only one I know who got a first class first at Delhi University for reasons that had nothing to do with academics and largely to do with sexual frustration. But I did. I got my first, and otherwise I wouldn't have got to Cambridge. But it was at Cambridge where I was very prominent in the union. In fact, I spent most of my time in the union, and my batch of union mates were the only ones in the history of the United Kingdom who had beaten Oxford in the number of cabinet posts they held. They were all members of John Major's and Margaret Thatcher's cabinets. So it was a very challenging environment in which I, as a foreigner, as an Indian, had to make my way. And I think I succeeded in making my way.
Yes.
But it came to me suddenly one day that why am I feeling so at home in this foreign land? And that is when I discovered that I had been brought up to be an Englishman, that I was actually a coconut Indian. And that caused such a strong reaction in my mind that I determined to return to India and discover India for myself. And fortunately, in the Foreign Service, we have a period of training that is called Bharat Darshan. And I think my moment of really being proud of India was when I went to see the rock-cut temple at Ellora and said to myself that these Englishmen were wandering around in bearskins when we were making this marvel of the world. And then I read books, and I'm now a very proud Indian.
Okay. Like I said, if you have time, I'm going to come back to, you know, what possible this whole ecosystem, what impact it had on Indian politics. But we'll come to that. You know, I'm going to jump to 2-3 things which are interesting anecdotes and then talk about some of the more deeper political strands in your book. But first, you know, do regale the audience about your stint in Pakistan, because you have the most unusual take. I'm not even sure regale is the correct word, but you have the most unusual take on the hanging of Bhutto. And I think you must be one of maybe 2 liberals in the world that actually says that Bhutto needed to be hanged. Tell us why you would say something so shocking.
I don't think Bhutto needed to be hanged. I think that was a bad judgment. I think it was a judgment that was politically motivated. But there certainly was a dead body. And the dead body was the father of the only member of the PPP who had gone to Dhaka after Mujib's great victory in East Pakistan, Well, he'd won all over Pakistan. And Bhutto warned his PPP members that if anyone goes to Dhaka, I'll break his leg. That's what he'd said. That was a man called Ahmad Raza. And Ahmad Raza was sitting in the car when somebody who later said that he belonged to the official police of Pakistan had been ordered by Bhutto to fire at the car in order to kill Ahmad Raza. It didn't kill Ahmad Raza, it killed Raza's father, who was sitting next to him. So there was a dead body, there was a bullet, there was a very senior officer who said he'd been ordered to kill the person, but perhaps that amounted to manslaughter, since it was not Bhutto who had pulled the trigger. But I certainly believe that he was implicated in the murder. But according to the law in India as well as in Pakistan, you don't get, the punishment of hanging is for the rarest of rare crimes. And since he didn't actually pull the trigger, I think he should not have been hung. But that he was an awful man, I have absolutely no doubt. He was the one who quite unnecessarily declared a 1,000-year war on India. He was the one who caused the breakup of his own country. He was the one who got democratically elected, and then, as we've all got to know in India, how democratically elected people can behave in a very autocratic and dictatorial manner. He was like a parody, or his establishment was like a parody of our establishment today. So there was nothing redeemable about the man. He, in fact, when Hafiz Pirzada, who was his law minister, in the first cabinet meeting, called him Zulfi, he whipped around at him and said, just because I've slept with your aunt doesn't mean you can call me Zulfi. He was that kind of a person. He was not a nice person. I wouldn't have come to Quorum if Bhutto had been a member.
You make a very serious allegation in the book that he got his opponent's sons sodomized, and that, there's some pretty shocking things that you say. Having been a diplomat there, were you at all speaking of this contemporaneously at that time?
No, I arrived in December 1978. And on the day I arrived in Islamabad, actually, because the ambassador had summoned me there before I took up my job in Karachi. And in Islamabad, I overheard my ambassador speaking to a very close friend of mine from Cambridge, who was a lawyer, to get the latest on what was happening in the trial. And of course, everyone in Pakistan was more obsessed with the trial than they were with any other subject. And very soon thereafter, the High Court of Lahore declared him guilty. And it was a day that I can never forget, because the left-hand lead story in the Sun newspaper said, High Court confirms Bhutto's hanging. And the right side said, Visa office to open shortly, Aiyar. So I found that the Pakistanis were really interested in two things. One, will Bhutto hang? And second, how to get the hell out of the country. So that was, in some ways, my introduction to the country. But I did hear the most horrific stories. One was from Mangi. Mangi was a senior politician from the Sakkar region of Upper Sindh. And Larkana, which was Bhutto's hometown, was just a few kilometers to the west of Sakkar. So it was Mangi who really brought him into politics, nurtured him, and enabled him to become the commerce minister of Ayub Khan at the age of 32. Now, I met Mangi, and Mangi was delighting at the hanging of Mr. Bhutto. I was a bit astonished at that. And then he went on to tell the story. Apparently, he had criticized some policy of Mr. Bhuttos on the floor of the House, and Bhutto immediately had him jailed. He was put into Mangopir jail on no charges, he was just put into jail. And then the warden came to him at about 10 o'clock at night and said, Ki, the Prime Minister is on the line. Aap mere office aaiye. So he went to the office, he picked up the phone, and there was Bhutto saying, this is the literal conversation, Mangi sun rahe ho kya? And he picked up a spoon and he clinked it on his crystal glass and said, Wahi raat bitana hai ya mere saath drink peene aaye ho? And Mangi uttered an oath that I cannot repeat in the presence of ladies and said, just screw off. This is the way in which he treats his own political guru. There were other similar horrible tales that I heard from some of his closest friends, from people whom he'd known since he was the age of nothing. Let me just give one more story. The first person I met was a man called Ilahi Baksh Sumro. Ilahi Baksh is still alive. He's about 94 years old, and I'm told by his son that he's lost his memory. But nevertheless, I'll tell the story. Ilahi Baksh was the great landlord living in Shikarpur, which is to Delhi like Meerut is, just nearby. And one day, Ilahi Baksh was wandering his large land holdings when the SP, the Superintendent of Police, came up, stopped his jeep, saluted, and told Ilahi Baksh that he was under arrest. So he said, for what? He said, I don't know. I've received orders that I have to take you to the central jail in Sakar. So I said, there they'll tell you. So when they arrived at the Sakar jail, the warden, he asked the warden, ki, mujhe kyun kaid kiya hai? And the chap said, मैं क्या जानूं? हमें तो बताया गया है कि डकैती, रेप और मर्डर तीनों के रजिस्टर खुले रखें और बाद में वो हमें बताएंगे कि आपका क्या दोष है. This is the way in which the man ran the country. So it's no wonder that I don't share any great sympathy for him, but I do believe that his hanging was an act of injustice because it was against the law.
Right. So, Mani, of all the CV that you have gathered over the years, the one that you bitterly fought was to be called a communist, and you almost never made it to being a diplomat because, you had this attached to you that you were a red sympathizer. How did that come to you, and how did you fight that? Why was it so important? Because at that time, there was a big sort of, India still had affinity with Russia and with China and, a softer version of communism. And this communists were, of course, all part of your ilk of the brown sahibs. So why was it so wrong to be called a communist?
I think the fact is that my political growing up was at the age of 15 when the Suez Canal was nationalized. And as you know, that was the last major act of British and French imperialism, along with Israeli imperialism, which is still going on. So I read the newspapers then and was horrified that this is the way in which white people are treating people from other continents. And I found that Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then, was being very pro-India. It was also a time when Bulganin and Khrushchev had the previous year, when I was 14 years old, visited India, and the reception that they were given was there were millions of people who went out to meet them. I mean, now we have 30,000 people who are gathered in some stadium in America, and it's called a great thing. But in those days, there used to be millions on the road and lakhs of people at the Ramlila grounds where there would be a civic reception. So my orientation was towards thinking of the Soviet Union as a friend and the United States as an enemy. But much, much more than that, I now realize, was that I was the poorest boy in the richest school. My mother, as a widow who'd lost her husband, couldn't afford to let us have home clothes. So we used to spend our holidays dressed in our school clothes because there were no home clothes being given to us. And when my aunt got married, her newly married husband took me to a shop in Lucknow and bought me a multicolored bush shirt that looked a bit like the one that Dev Anand wore in a film called CID, which was a great hit in those days. And that was such an unusual occurrence that till today I remember the date on which I got my first bush shirt. It was the 16th of June, 1957. And I noticed that all my other school colleagues were ludicrously rich. One of my school colleagues was a guy called Amarinder Singh, who became twice over the Chief Minister of Punjab. He was the Maharaja of Patiala, and he had smuggled into the school 100 rupees. Now, 100 rupees in 1955 was equal to about 10,000 rupees today. It was an humongous amount of money. And because I was a day scholar, he handed this 100 rupee note to me and asked me to buy him tuck from town. Sorry?
Yeah, no, I'm just kind of aware of time and how, so I just want to take you into the...
I bought this wretched thing, gave it to him, and then the idiot decided that he would hold an exhibition of it. And the story went around the house that he was carrying special tuck for the midterm holiday. The housemaster, who was a sadist, he went there, discovered it, got hold of me, and said, I'll punish you after the midterm break. So for 5 days, I wondered whether I was going to be rusticated or not. So in this atmosphere, where there were some very rich people, and all of them seemed set to go into a grand life, and on their midterm holidays would be sporting the most expensive clothing, while I was in a white shirt and white ducks. I think emotionally, I grew anti-rich people. And it was only because I was emotionally anti-rich people, and I apologize to all of you here, because all of you are rich. But it was your kind and your children who were my classmates. And I therefore decided that since Marx had said that we should be destroying everybody, I thought it was a damn good idea that we should improve our society by massacring all my classmates. And that is what made me a communist. But when I went to St. Stephen's, there was intellectual content given. And I really went to Cambridge as blood red. But at Cambridge, I asked specially for tuitions with Maurice Dobb, who was the leading communist of the university, and whose book called Soviet Economic Development since 1917 had made a huge impression on me while I was a college boy. Yeah. But when I went to these tutorials, I found that he couldn't answer any of my questions, that he was a god with clay feet. Indeed, I thought he was a god with clay head. So I ceased being a commie, but our intelligence bureau, and I never understood why they're called the Intelligence Bureau, because this is the one quality they lack. They picked up some newspaper items about me as being a communist, and they kept me out of the Foreign Service. And if I may just finish that story, because it connects up with what I told you about my mother. In the meanwhile, Dr. Radhakrishnan, my mother's host, when she was a little girl of 20, he had become the president of India. So Amma went to see him, And I was called in on the day I reached India, and he just asked me one question. He said, "Are you a member of the British Communist Party?" And I said, "I couldn't be because I'm not a British national." And I said, "Our intelligence, or whatever they call themselves, our idiots, must know that I'm not a member of the Indian Communist Party." And he said that Nehru had said that any civil servant can vote for any party he wants, but cannot be a member of even the Congress Party. And so Radhakrishnan ordered that the government of India should look into my case. It took 4 or 5 months, but in the end, and this is the climax of the story, I've seen the file when I was a cabinet minister. It was shown to me. There is a note by the Home Minister recommending that I should be taken into the service. And the note that follows, I quote, says, "I agree. I too have heard good reports of Mani Shankar Aiyar. He may be taken into the Indian Foreign Service and sent to Missouri for his training." Signed, Jawaharlal Nehru, 23rd October, 1963. So I was one of the very, very few to be admitted under Nehru's own signature into the Foreign Service.
Right. Well, part of that story, I was just thinking that, Nirja Chaudhary recently had a book where she said how prime ministers decide, and she was tracing all the personal, that whole cocktail of personal and public that goes into all the decision making that ends up shaping our lives. And listening to your story, I was thinking of all the people that critique why the Congress didn't open up into market forces, did not align with America. So much of that comes actually from personal origins. Like you said, your anti-rich psyche, anti-business.
I was only anti-rich because I was not rich myself. I'm sure I'd have been anti-poor if I'd been rich.
Right. Well, Mani, I want to quickly accelerate into...
Can I just finish with one story, though? That is that when I got into the service, one of my closest friends, who was 1 year senior to me in the Foreign Service, said they found you were a Marxist, but of the Groucho variety.
So, Mani, you ended up being with Rajiv Gandhi through the most tumultuous years. And I want you to, go through some of those sort of public milestones which impacted all our lives and continue to play out now. But I want to first start with, when you look back on these years, what are the 2 or 3 things that you most deeply regret doing?
Deeply regret?
Yes.
I regret, je ne regrette rien.
You want to speak?
That's a famous song by Edith Piaf. I regret nothing. They were the most significant years of my life. Actually, I didn't know Rajiv Gandhi at all. One of the great things about Doon School was that we didn't really care a fig who was the son of whom. So Rajiv came to the school 3 years after I did. And in a school where you are there for 5 years, a 3-year difference is so enormous that you just don't know anybody who's 3 years junior to you. But of course, all of them know me. So Rajiv knew me, but I didn't know him. And the only memory I have of him is of his walking up to me after I'd passed my senior Cambridge exam and was spending an extra term in school. As a senior, I was allowed to swim at any time I wanted. But juniors had fixed hours, and outside those hours, they could swim only if they had the permission of a senior boy. So I do remember this very shy young man walking up to me with his left ankle rubbing his right ankle and saying, "Yaar, give us permission to swim, yaar." Now, the usual senior reaction in Doon School is to use a word beginning with F and ending with off. Fortunately, I didn't say that. I very graciously gave him permission. And I've often wondered whether if I'd refused him, he'd have ever taken me into the Prime Minister's office. Because none of us really cared that he was the grandson of the Prime Minister. And he was very shy about it.
But
So I didn't know him when he took me into the PMO.
so, Mani, I'm going to take you into a little bit of self-analysis here beyond just the anecdotal. That, you know, in the book, and I was disturbed even while reading this, that you defend his Shah Bano judgment, his Shah Bano decision. And, you know, you're constantly kind of positing all the mistakes of opening up the temple, the Shilanayas, the decisions that ended up making him go from 400 seats to 200. You posit it on Arun Nehru, you posit it on R.K. Dhawan, on Sheila Dikshit. You know, there are many people you're blaming there. And at the heart of it, Mani, for all your brilliance, your wit, you know, this very sort of storied life that you led, it strikes me that, you know, so many of you are called loyalists, family loyalists, Gandhi loyalists, rather than Congress veterans, you know. And that's where I would like to ask you that when you look back on those years, why is there no ability to analyze a leader like him? Even Shah Bano, all these decisions, why are you called a loyalist rather than a good, staunch, intelligent congressman?
Actually, about 200 pages of this book, which were about Rajiv's years, were rejected by my publisher on the grounds that they were biography and not autobiography. So eventually we arrived at a compromise that those 200 pages would be taken out and published separately as a book called The Rajiv I Knew and Why He Was the Most Misunderstood Prime Minister of India. And that second volume, which I call the companion volume, is now at an advanced stage of preparation. And I have just had a confirmation this morning that it's likely to be launched in the week between the 15th and the 22nd of January.
Right,
So
but to answer my question.
you have to remember that since you read only the first volume, you're putting me at a great disadvantage by asking me this question. Because I was asked to remove all the justification and to reduce 200 pages of justification into about 2 or 3 pages of brief mention. I hope Quorum will invite me once again and have you as the interlocutor. And when that book comes out, we can talk about Shah Bano, we can talk about Bofors, we can talk about the IPKF, we can talk about everything that was controversial and those achievements that he had, which are not much talked about, so that we have a proper analysis at that stage of what my argument is. When you are asked to reduce 200 pages to about 2 or 3 pages, then you get the impression that you're a loyalist. Obviously, you believe that the Shah Bano decision was a wrong one. And you're calling me a loyalist because I said it was the right one. It so happens, I am now jumping into my second volume, although I mentioned it in passing here, that Daniel Latifi, who was a very well-known Muslim lawyer, he was a communist, so perhaps it's wrong to call him a Muslim. Daniel Latifi filed a writ petition against the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act 1986 in September 86. The Supreme Court gave a decision on it 15 years later, in 2001. And in 2001, they said that far from, this is the Supreme Court of India, I'm quoting, said far from reversing the 1985 decision, what Rajiv Gandhi did was to codify it. He brought it into Indian civil law. And decisions on whether meher had been paid, whether compensation had been paid during the period of iddat, was determined not by a qazi, but determined by a magistrate. And for the last 22 years, all Muslim women's divorce cases which go above the magistrate's level are being decided by the Supreme Court. For 20 years, Rajiv Gandhi's decision has been validated by the Supreme Court of India. And you're asking me today why I'm a loyalist? I'm a loyalist because he was right. And who says he was right? Not me. It was the Supreme Court.
Yeah, of course.
And in an equal way, since you brought up Shabano, and doubtless will bring up Bofors, there was a similar decision on Bofors. On Bofors, the High Court of Delhi, on the 4th of February 2004, said that there is not a scintilla of evidence. I'm quoting the expression, not a scintilla of evidence that he took even a penny. And this went because of Sri Chand Ahuja, Hinduja, it went before another High Court judge called R.S. Sodhi, who on the 31st of May 2005 said there is absolutely no evidence against Rajiv Gandhi. And then when the Modi government came into power, they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court dismissed it as saying after 4,522 days of investigation, the CBI have not turned up a single word of evidence against Rajiv Gandhi. And yet, not you personally, but your fraternity or your sorority just went hammer and tongs. I am trying to give justice. I am not being a loyalist. A loyalist is a very negative term, as if I'm being loyal just because he was a friend of mine. He was no friend of mine. I never called him anything but sir. He never came to my house except when my mother died to condole. He never invited me to his house. I've never had a meal with him except when we happened to be touring together. He was no friend of mine, and I had no reason to be loyal to him. But I did feel that the journalist fraternity went for him like a pack of jackals. And therefore, I am as strong as you lot were. If you were furious and vicious in attacking him, well, I'll be furious and vicious in defending him. But you'll have to wait for the second book.
Mani, but it's true about the two Supreme Court judgments, but just in terms of, you're saying to wait for the second book, so either we'll have to do that. But like I said, there are other key milestones in his life, and again, I will bring you into discussing what was fantastic and positive about him. But what I'm asking you is about this ability to analyze, and the kind of disarray that the Congress is in. The analysis is that so much of it flows back for the need to sort of stonewall the Gandhi family rather than sticking to the principles on which the party was formed. So that's why I'm asking you for an analysis of him. That, like I said, on all the other decisions, you pinpoint Arun Nehru, and yes, even Nirja Chaudhary has some absolutely shocking, revelations about Arun Nehru. But, and it's amazing how a lateral entry like him, just a cousin of the family, can get to be so powerful in that setup. But then if you look at the root cause, how was just a cousin of the family that powerful, So that's why I'm asking you to analyze that when you look back in a capsule of what was good about Rajiv Gandhi and what was perhaps foolish, negative, what would your analysis be in a capsule?
In all fairness to me, I think you should tell the audience that my reaction to the appointment of Rajiv Gandhi was one of complete horror.
Rajiv Gandhi, no? Arun.
Rajiv Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi.
After the riots.
Was of simple horror. I said, how can an Indian Airlines pilot be running this country? And then, I'm not going to go into that because that will take up all the remaining time. I do about 30 pages on the Sikh pogrom that took place in the first month of his prime ministership. in which I have been extremely critical of what went wrong. I have also pointed out that subsequent to that, he should have immediately dismissed the police commissioner. He should have immediately announced a commission of inquiry. He should have immediately apologized. And that the failure to do these three things has resulted in November 1984 being the single biggest stain on his reputation. I think in fairness to me, before accusing me of loyalty, you should have mentioned those pages. Please read them. They are extremely critical. I've also said in those pages that owing to what happened in November 1984, I decided to vote against the Congress. And I went to vote against the Congress in December 1984, but unfortunately, my name was not on the voters list, so that particular sin did not attach to me. I've also said that I knew nothing of this man until Operation Blue Star took place. When Operation Blue Star took place, I was the Joint Secretary of the United Nations. But I had earlier, just earlier, been the spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs. So the Foreign Secretary asked me to join a special unit called the Special Publicity Group that had been set up. And my particular job was to persuade the Sikh diaspora outside India that the Harmandir Sahib had not been destroyed. And that even if the Akal Takht had been brought down, there had been orders given to the army to not shoot in the direction of the Harmandir Sahib. And while there were one or two bullet holes that I myself saw, by and large, the Harmandir Sahib had been saved. So I was contacting, through our embassies and consulates, various media channels, largely run by Indians in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, and also reaching out in other ways to Sikh communities in Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Africa, about what was happening. And my reports, which were a daily report, I didn't know were being sent to the Prime Minister's office. And Rajiv Gandhi had been asked by Indira to look after the external dimension of Operation Blue Star. And that is how he came to know me. So I didn't know the man at all. And the only thing I knew was that he was a complete dumbcoff in school. He succeeded in getting a low second in the senior Cambridge. At Cambridge, he had the high distinction, because it's very difficult to get that degree. He actually failed. It's very difficult to fail at Cambridge. It's only one or two rare specimens who fail. He was one of those rare specimens. He then went to the Imperial College in London, and he failed there. So the only Rajiv Gandhi I knew was a man who was completely undistinguished in school, who had failed at Cambridge, failed subsequently, become a pilot, and suddenly was made Prime Minister. So you can't call me a loyalist from the stop. I was brought in because of my professional competence. But after I started working with him, I discovered that he had enormous qualities of head and heart, and a tremendous dedication to the national interest over the party interest. In a few words, because I needed a whole book, please read the book when it comes. But tell me, what was his inheritance? His inheritance was insurgency in Punjab. Who stopped it? He did. How did he do it? By enabling the Akali Dal to form a government and make the Congress lose its opportunity. How did he solve it in Assam? By removing the Congress government and allowing the AGP to come in. How did he solve it in Mizoram? By removing the Congress chief minister and bringing his biggest enemy, Laldenga in as the Chief Minister of Mizoram. Here was a man who consistently put national interest above party interest. And you expect me not to admire that? Who was the one who did Panchayati Raj as a constitutional measure? It was something I was deeply involved with. It is not a Doon School thing. It was not a Cambridge thing. It was not a rich man's thing. As I wandered with him in my capacity as manager tours and travels all over the country, we walked in numerous rural areas, on rural roads, through Kichad, walked into the houses of Dalits, walked into the houses of minorities, walked into the houses of tribals. And there he discovered that what was coming from the center, what was coming from the states, was not reaching the last man.
His famous
And
phrase.
hence Panchayati Raj. Now, I was deeply involved with that. There's an entire chapter in my second book which deals with that. So I hope we'll talk about his constructive measures. And he is the one man who had the guts to say, I'm going to China. I'm going to China and I'm going to sign an agreement with them which gave us 35 years of peace and tranquility. Why aren't you admiring that? I'm admiring it. That's not loyalty. It's loyalty to my country. It's not loyalty to Nehru or the Gandhis. Then finally, he was the first prime minister in, I've forgotten how many years, from 1960 onwards, 28 years, to go to Pakistan. And later he said that had Zia lived, he'd found a solution to the Siachen Glacier. So therefore, here was a man of enormous achievements and enormous failures. I've described the IPKF disaster in very great detail in my next book.
So of
this
course, Mani.
portrait of me, my last sentence, this portrait of me, which you journalists have been putting out, कि ये तो कोई टट्टू है, ये तो बस बूटलिकर है, ये तो बस चमचा है, ये बस मक्खन लगाता है. I have been defamed by your lot for the last 50 years. But because I'm a maverick and because I'm a man of principle, I stand up and say, I will stand up for what is right. I'll stand up for everything that Rajiv Gandhi did that was right. And I'll stand against him for everything that he did wrong, which begins with the Sikh pogrom of 1984. You might have noticed that I don't call it a Sikh riot, I call it a Sikh pogrom.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you spoke with that conviction, Mani. As you know, I was not old enough to be writing at that time, so when you keep saying you lot, I'll absorb it for my sorority and fraternity. But no, and I'm glad that you're speaking with conviction, because part of the great malaise of our contemporary politics is that the Congress does not speak with conviction about its own principles. So I'm glad you do. The criticism that I was putting about your book, and forgive me because I haven't read your other 200 pages, is that I would absolutely, and that's exactly what I said, that praise him for what is good, but as a key leader, when you allow such an ecosystem of, of completely malafide advisors around you, and you go by that decision, you go by their advice, and you create cataclysmic milestones for the country, then when you're doing a memoir, I would have liked to see more critique of that. Now you're telling me that 200 pages are going to come. For me, I'm reading this book. And like I said, I was disturbed by aspects of it, not by all of it. And again, I'd be the last person to say that, I'm amazed the Congress doesn't stand up for Nehru today. One of the most amazing leaders that we've had, with all his warts and all. So I'm glad you're speaking with conviction. But I said, if it was, of course, blame R.K. Dhawan, blame Arun Nehru, blame
But
Fatehdar.
I had failed to answer the second part of your question. The fact of the matter is that the Congress is Gandhi obsessed. They're unfortunately not Mahatma Gandhi obsessed. And you're quite right in saying that there's very little talk of the principles and philosophy and outlook of Jawaharlal Nehru. From the time of Indira Gandhi and right down to the present, there is a tendency to treat the Gandhis as the rationale of the Congress. I don't treat them as the rationale of the Congress, but I recognize that the Gandhi family is the bonding adhesive. If the Gandhi family had not existed, by now the Congress party would have disintegrated into half a dozen parties. As it is, there are many breakaways from the Congress party, and most of the parties in the opposition were started by ex-congressmen. And that began back in 1948 when Jayaprakash Narayan, whom Nehru wanted as his successor, he was very keen that Jayaprakash should be the Prime Minister of India after him. But Jayaprakash broke from him, Ashok Mehta broke from him, and subsequently many others have broken from Indira Gandhi, they've broken from Rajiv Gandhi, they've set up their own parties, because the Congress before independence was not a party, it was a movement. In fact, even till today, in Tamil Nadu, the Congress party is referred to as a per iyakkam. That means a great movement. They call all other political parties katshis, which mean parties. But the Congress is called the per iyakkam, the great movement, because before independence, it was the great movement, and you could be a member of the Congress and also president of the Hindu Mahasabha.
And Shama Prasad Mukherjee.
So was Madan Mohan Malviya, so was Lala Lajpat Rai. Jinnah was a member of the Congress and a member of the Muslim League. So the Congress has an origin as a movement and is still adjusting to being a party. But if it is held together, whether you like it or not, it's an objective fact that the Gandhi family keeps the party together. And the Gandhi family can be very arbitrary. They chose in the 1990s and into the first few years of the 21st century to give me a position. Then they decided to kick me out. So I have suffered triple talaq. All the three Gandhis have given me divorce. And, but I remain a congressman. And I remain a congressman because I believe in Nehru. Nehru for me is the Congress, and of course so is Mahatma Gandhi. But Indira Gandhi, I'm very critical of what she did during the emergency. I think she did great things before the emergency. Her second coming was not a success, and her particular disaster was not being able to handle the revolt of the Khalistanis correctly, and that caused her death. I'm not a Rajiv Gandhiist because he was handling his problems in his day, and I believe that while his values were right, I'm not sure that you can project the same policies into the 21st century. Alas, he died. I think he had a great deal of potential in him, and maybe had he lived, we'd have had you'd have had the opportunity as a journalist of re-evaluating Rajiv Gandhi. Then we've seen that Sonia Gandhi, a foreigner, is so accepted in our polity that when the India Alliance attempted to meet in Patna, they really couldn't succeed. And then when Sonia arrived in Mumbai, the India Alliance was formed. If there is an elder statesman acceptable to all parties other than the BJP, the one person who stands out is Sonia Gandhi. So, when you say, give up your Gandhi worship, you're effectively saying to me, give up your biggest asset. Now, would you go to the BJP and say, yeah, it is too much Modi worship? There is too much Modi worship. There's too much Modi worship, just give up Modi. Would they accept? Why should we
No, their
not
money,
have...
their money, I'm going to, one, we've opened up so many strands that in all fairness to myself, we would now need a 300 hours of conversation to analyze all of this. But just on this, because it's so starkly disparate, is that by no means, and like I said, I think my body of work shows that by no means am I somebody who enjoys authoritarianism or communalism or any of the negative aspects of the BJP. But as a journalist, I'd recognize what they have, which is energy. What the Congress doesn't have right now is energy. But when you're saying they should give up Modi at a juncture when Modi is delivering for them, is very different from the criticism swirling around the Congress and the Gandhi family right now, because consistently the Gandhi family is not delivering electoral benefits. I'm not talking about their values or etc. They're not delivering electorally, but the party doesn't have courage to try anybody else. That's the difference. So that was not a correct analogy. That's
No,
all.
but the word consistently is misused, if you'll forgive me. We consistently won for 10 years. We've consistently lost for 9 years. How can you say that we are consistently losing? And now, I personally believe that we lost in 2014 because Mr. Modi got 31% of the vote, which means 69% Indians did not vote for Mr. Modi. In 2019, Mr. Modi got 38% of the vote, which means 62% did not vote for him. So what is the logic of the India Alliance? It is to try to bring together as much of this majority as possible, which has been losing because it is scattered. Now the problem is that in the states, the Congress is very often the party which is opposed to the dominant party. So the India Alliance is not meant for state elections, which is why you see currently that in the 5 states that are going to elections, there is a great deal of jitpit between the alliance partners. But the India Alliance was never meant for state elections. It was meant for the national election. And they have succeeded in coming together, and I believe it was Sonia Gandhi who brought them together. They've formed a platform, they've given themselves a name. The name has had the impact, such an impact, that Mr. Modi is now giving up Skill India, anything India, and he's calling it Bharat. Well, that's fine. That's just to oppose this India Alliance. It's an indication of what a powerful subject it has given itself. Now, this India Alliance has to prove itself through arithmetic and chemistry. Arithmetic is seat sharing. Chemistry is having a common program with appealing features. If that is done, then I predict that in 2024, Mr. Modi will be defeated. If it is not done, I predict that he'll win.
Well, Mani, as I said, right now we are 1 hour into the conversation. There are too many strands. So I'm going to, because this is not a contemporary politics, it was meant to be focused on your memoir. So I'm going to leave it over there. But I don't, I mean, we could dissect a lot of what you're saying. To begin with, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, whether you're pro-BJP, pro-Congress, pro-whatever nuance of the entire political spectrum, I think as citizens, all of us would want very strong opposition, very strong government, very robust politics. We're not getting that yet in the country, and that's why I think one spends so much time critiquing the opposition more than the government. The government's doing what it has to do or what its own ideology says it should do. The rest is in disarray, So I'm just going to ask you 2 quick ones, and then we'll open it up for questions. You said about chemistry, and a big part of, I did an interview with Prashant Kishore recently, and he was also being very scathing about the opposition, because the one thing he said is, what is it that they're selling? What is the story? What is the idea? What is the India that the opposition is backing, which is not just about getting Modi out? So you being a man of words, 2 things I'd ask you to define right now. One is this much maligned word of secularism, you know. In your book, not what it meant earlier, today in 2023, what should secularism mean? Can you pivot it? Can you nuance it? Can you give us a soaring description of it? And number two is that what do you think should be the narrative of the India Alliance?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Insofar as values are concerned, I don't think goodness, compassion, truth are contextualized. They exist irrespective of what the conditions are. And as far as a country like India is concerned, we cannot remain one country unless we are secular. Secularism is the basis of our nationhood. And the reason for that is that we are perhaps the most diverse nation in the world. And secularism does not apply only to religion. It also applies to caste, it applies to language, it applies to ethnic identity. It applies to all the various things which make each of us, sitting in this room even, different. Different in terms of which state do we belong to. We're all Bombay-walas, but we have our origins elsewhere. We speak different languages. I feel I'm a Tamil, although I never lived in Tamil Nadu. I believe I'm a refugee from Pakistan. I'm a Tamil Brahmin refugee from Pakistan, which makes me the smallest minority in India. I believe that the civility of a society, the extent to which it's civilized, depends on how it treats its minorities. If we cannot treat our minorities as equal citizens, then how can you be a Parsi? How can you be a Christian? How can you be a Sikh? How can you be a Muslim? I then carry forward. How can you be a Tamil? How can you be a Dravidian? How can you be a Bengali? How can you be a Punjabi? How can you be a Sikh? So, and above all, how can you be a Kashmiri if your Kashmiriyat is denied? So all this comes within the ambit of secularism. So secularism is, to again repeat an expression I've used earlier, it is the bonding adhesive of our nationhood. And Rajiv Gandhi once said, if you'll forgive my quoting a person.
I didn't want to sting you so bad, Mani.
All right, let me quote him.
Phrase
he
for the
said
rest of your life.
That India is secular, and if it weren't secular, perhaps it doesn't deserve to exist. So to that extent, secularism cannot be contextualized. There is not one secularism for 1947 and another secularism for 1950, a third secularism for 1967, a fourth for 1984, and a fifth for today. Secularism is secularism.
But Mani, there I wanted, why I asked you for context, is that do you think because of some of the mistakes made in the name of secularism, that what you were just describing is a very self-confident, very beautiful, and absolutely the essence of India is plurality, you know? And that one absolutely protects that rather than always talking of it in terms of minority. And what I see as a journalist and or like as somebody in 2023, I often say that in fact, the minorities have had to bear the burden of the liberals' desire to be secular. In what way? That very often one ends up protecting, bolstering the regressive elements in minority communities just for us to wear our secular credentials, you know? I would never submit to any government making the sadhus or the clerics or the patriarchy within Hinduism to be my keepers. Whereas it's bizarre, you know, rather than playing to the modern, the aspirational, the women within the Muslim community, all secularists and liberals want to hand over that community almost like frozen in time to its clerics. Why? Why must you play to the most regressive? We don't have this. I can understand straight after partition that what Nehru could push through the Hindu code bill, you would not touch the Muslim code bill there because there's so much of pain, there's so much of wound, there's so much of anxiety about the fate of Muslims in India. But 75 years later, why would not one have the confidence to deal as Indian citizens rather than to say, because they're Muslims, let's play to their clerics. If the clerics want to be regressive, we should allow that regressiveness, not have an open conversation about it, not have a robust. I've had the most amazing conversations with Muslim women, which one can't have in good faith with liberals. And I think that's a huge fault line, you know? That's why I was hoping that with all that's going on, you would come up with a new version of it. But it's still couched as the minority, they're citizens, you know? Let's deal with that same self-confidence.
Really?
I'm saying
Do you know
that's
how
what's
many
needed.
Muslims there are from the ruling party in parliament?
Of course, but that's what we
Just a
should
minute.
fight. That's what we should fight. Not why are you playing to the clerics?
Well, there's zero.
Exactly.
And
That's
the
what we should
only-
fight.
The only organization that can change personal law is parliament. When the Hindu code bill was brought in, there were 95% Hindus in parliament. And yet, had it not been for Nehru, none of that legislation would have been passed because the President of India refused to sign the bills. So just be careful to note that you are an exception, you're not the rule. And as a woman, you have your own concerns. How many nikahs have you attended? I don't think you have. I have attended the nikahs. The nikah ceremony among the Muslims is the most equal thing you can imagine. The families get together, they determine what are the terms of the marriage, not the terms of the marriage, but the terms that will apply if the marriage breaks up. Can you imagine a Hindu wedding based upon determining what will happen if we get divorced? A Muslim marriage is essentially a contract designed against the breakup of the marriage. And it stipulates what are the rights of the woman in the event of the marriage breaking up. And those conditions, the single most important part of it is that unlike in many other communities where the girl is given away, a Muslim girl is never given away by her father. She retains a lien, a religious lien, a spiritual lien, a customary lien, and a traditional lien on her family of birth. And it becomes the duty of, if the father doesn't exist, if the brother doesn't exist, of the male members. You asked me a question, I'm giving you the answer. You asked me, unfortunately, a very complicated question, and therefore I have to give a complicated answer. And I'm telling you things you didn't know. And therefore I
No, I was just going to correct the terms of our question. Was not that I would, because you're,
No,
you're
I
giving
have
an
to answer
explanation of you're giving an explanation of Muslim marriage contracts. I'm not talking about
You haven't
changing
even
the.
allowed me to finish.
Okay.
Let me finish. All these then say that if the girl's family does not look after her, then the Waqf board is required to do so. But until Rajiv Gandhi, the Waqf board was to be instructed by the Qazi. Rajiv Gandhi's main amendment were two forms. And I don't think you know them, because you're so opposed to the bill that you won't read the bill. His two things were that if the Waqf board does not look after the woman, then the complaint can be made to the magistrate. That is what I meant by saying it was codified. It becomes a matter of civil law if compensation and maintenance is not paid. It becomes a matter of law and therefore will be enforced through the courts. The second thing, the genius that lay in that is if you read sections 3 and 4, it does not say payment for iddat. That is the 3 months when the couple are not required, are expected not to have any relations with each other so that the girl gets pregnant. It does not say that you have to pay the compensation for the period of iddat. It specifically says you have to pay compensation within the period of iddat, which means that it has to be for at least 2 years. And why 2 years? Because in the Muslim community, there is no social stigma attached to remarriage. So you've got to take into consideration what were the social conditions of the Muslims before you, as a non-Muslim, start recommending what changes should be made in Muslim personal law. We never said that there can be no changes in Muslim personal law. We said, let the changes come from within. And the Law Commission has 3 or 4 times looked into the possibility of changing Muslim personal law and come to the conclusion that unless the community does it itself, it cannot be done from outside. And what is more, if you want to change this, you'll have to also agree to changing Syrian Christian law. You'll also have to agree to changing tribal law.
No, of course.
So therefore,
Mani, like I said,
it is a far more complicated question than the very simplistic terms in which you as a feminist put the question. As if I'm male and therefore against Muslim women, and you're a woman and therefore you're for Muslim women. I am as for Muslim women as you are, but I do not regard Muslim personal law as a barbaric Arab desert business.
Mani, I have to say a couple of things, which is that in my entire questioning, I have not adjectivized you, nor have I made assumptions. I've said these are the interpretations, and I've given you the space to speak about it. So just out of absolute courtesy, I would like you not to keep essentializing me either as a feminist or as a woman. None of those identities are how I was posing a question to you, so I think that's a little bit unfair. And number 2 is that I was not asking about changing Muslim law, nor was I referring to the Uniform Code Bill. I was asking about playing to the clerics as being the voice of a community. And when you're talking about wanting change from within, and we are going into very complex conversations, as you said, so I will draw a line on that. Just hold on. Just hold on, Mani. You've spoken. Mani, you had time to speak. Mani, 2 minutes out of... Can you give me the courtesy to finish my question? Because I heard you through. Is that even with the triple talaq, there are Muslim women who were asking for the triple talaq to be removed. And as I said, out of the noblesse oblige of appearing secular, one did not want the triple talaq even to be removed, which in Indonesia, Pakistan, etc. is removed. So I'm asking a very nuanced question. You're bringing me down to essentials which are absolutely not my position. So I do want to put that on record. But let's move away from that. We have dinner, because I do want to open this up to the audience. No, we are not discussing triple talaq yet. Just hold on, let me open this up, because the audience will have a chance to interact with you after this. I want to end on a lighter note, which is that, you know, when we were talking about Rajiv Gandhi and Stalin and Russia and all of that, there's a lovely anecdote in Mani's book where Gorbachev, struggling to retain Russia as a country, asked Rajiv Gandhi that how do you hold a country like India together? And Rajiv Gandhi asked M.K. Narayanan, who was the National Security Advisor, to put together a document for Gorbachev. And that came to Rajiv Gandhi's hands, and he said, because M.K. Narayanan was a National Security Advisor, he had talked about all the ways in which dissent had been suppressed and, you know, all the knuckles that had been put on people. And Rajiv Gandhi actually said, he asked Mani that, is this how we've been holding the country together? And then Mani actually put together a very elevated, very enlightened, very beautiful version of how India is kept together, which ended up becoming the basis of Rajiv Gandhi's centenary lecture on Nehru. And Mani was the author of that. And I want to steer the conversation back to that. that here is the mix of the inspirational and the analytical and the mistakes and the soaringness of being in the midst of politics, always difficult in a country like India. And I was trying to have those conversations with you, Mani, not out of trying to provoke you into anger, but my most fervent desire right now is to have really good faith and really complex conversations which will illuminate rather than label and polarize. So I hope we can continue this over dinner. I'm going to open this up for everybody else. Thank you very, very much, all of you. It's been a long conversation. Are there any questions, or do you want to close this and have it over drinks?
We can have 2 more questions.
He was director of the Intelligence Bureau.
Okay. Yeah, there was no national security advisor.
Hello. Yeah, hi. I've watched with interest Rahul Gandhi's Bharat Jodo Yatra, which is a secular sort of thing that captured the imagination of people. Would like your views on that, but that's not my question. My question is, do you think in the next election he should allow Mallikarjun Kharge to be the Congress's prime ministerial candidate and be the chief ideologue?
Kharge to be
the prime ministerial candidate of the Congress party, and he should be the president of the chief ideologue.
Well, as far as I've been able to understand, and please remember that I am triple divorced by the Gandhi family, so I'm not really intimate with what they say. As far as I'm able to make out, Rahul Gandhi has never expressed the desire to become the Prime Minister of India. And it is he who stepped aside to bring in Mr. Kharge as the president of the Congress party. And I do agree with you that I think it would be an excellent idea if the prime ministerial face that was to be projected might be that of Mr. Kharge. But this is an India alliance. It involves a huge number of parties, and there has to be consensus among them about which will be the party and who will be the candidate of the party, who will be projected as the Prime Minister. The Congress on its own cannot do so without badly disturbing the India alliance. So the India alliance will take this decision, and were they to take the decision, if they were to take the decision, that they would like to see Mr. Kharge heading the alliance and thereby becoming the putative Prime Minister, I would certainly welcome that.
Is there any other question? Yes, of course.
I'm sorry, I don't have a complex question. In fact, I require a little confirmation. There is a small anecdote which we've continuously here attributed to you about you signing the visitors book at the St. Stephen's College centenary celebrations. And you know, anecdotes get elaborated as they go down the line. Can we hear it from the horse's mouth what actually happened?
Well, it's a true story. What happened was that I was invited by the informal discussion group of St. Stephen's College, which is a hoary old institution. It goes back to my days, which meets, I think, on Wednesday evenings to speak to them. And when I got to the college, they took me into the principal's room. Now, in my day, no student entered the principal's room except to be rusticated. So as I stepped into the principal's room, all my fears of being a 16-year-old came back to me. And when they presented me with the visitor's book, I really didn't know what to write in it. So I started flipping through the back pages to see what other people had written. And there was this entry which said, K. Natwar Singh. He has a very flowing hand. It said, K. Natwar Singh, Minister of State for External Affairs. And in the last column, the comments column, there was the line which said, I am what I am because of St. Stephen's. So I asked for a pencil and I wrote below it, why blame the college? And that has become a notorious story because it was picked up by India Today and reported by them. But I must say in defense of Natwar that he has never reprimanded me for that. And instead, he was invited to deliver what is called the commemoration address, which is done in the chapel of the college. And there he said, whatever Mani Shankar Aiyar may say, I am what I am because of St. Stephen's. So that is, I think, a typical St. Stephen's riposte.
So, I'm sure we can do this over drinks and dinner. Thank you very, very much, Mani. I did not want to only take you down an anecdotal path. You're a man of great substance. You've lived through so much of India's history that I enjoyed a much more substantive conversation with you. Even the friction of it, I think it's fantastic if we can continue creating spaces where friction can happen without ED and IT knocking at your door the next morning. So if neither of us have an ED raid on each other, we'll know that we are still in democratic India. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for listening in.